I was standing over a waterfall the other day that maybe when I was younger, I would have said, let's go do it. And the other folks in the group did it. And I was like, not today. And it was purely respect for the rapid itself. I probably could have done it just fine, but I knew the consequences if I didn't. And that's probably the biggest message of what we're saying. Like, how could you think differently about the food system? It's just that respect. It's that fundamental respect for nature that's like, it's incredibly powerful. You know, don't treat it like something you can just spray something on and you've got it all figured out. That's that kind of arrogance, history shows you, gets you in real trouble.
This is Andrew Vance, and you're listening to Choose the Hard Way, where my guests share stories about how doing hard things builds stronger people. If you enjoy this episode, please give it a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, subscribe, and forward it to a friend who likes doing hard things. If you want to suggest a guest or be in touch, you can reach me at choosethehardway@gmail.com or at hardwaypod on Twitter or Instagram. Is it possible to feed the world in a way that doesn't poison the environment and harm people? Do sustainable agricultural practices scale? In the long run, do weeds always win? My guest is Bart Elmore, an award-winning professor and writer who investigates the impact of big business on our environment. You might have caught Bart on Joe Rogan, where he discussed his most recent book, Seed Money: Monsanto's Past and Our Food Future. Seed Money traces the path from Agent Orange to Roundup and the impact it has had on public health, food production, the environment, and more. Bart is also the author of Citizen Coke: The Making of Coca-Cola Capitalism. I'd like to thank my good friend Aaron Cochran, the co-founder of Iced Coffee Please, for recommending Bart as a guest and for making this interview happen. Thank you, Aaron. On this episode, Bart and I go deep on the relationship between humans, plants, animals, and profit. And Bart shares about the false starts and the forces that shaped his professional path, including basketball, electronic music, and a failed attempt at a cross-country cycling trip. You can find Bart on social at Bart Elmore and at bartelmore.com. You can find those links in the show notes.
It started because I didn't have a lot of money when I went to grad school at the University of Virginia. I went there kind of on to work with this great historian, and ended up loving it, but just like really struggling financially. So there was this place downtown in Charlottesville that we started DJing at. A friend, it was like a pair, me and my friend Tim, and it was so great. It's how I met my wife when I was there, and it was like having this whole other life because you were doing graduate work. I was writing this project on Coca-Cola at the time and its environmental impact, and it was really heavy stuff. And being able to go out at like, now as a parent, it sounds ridiculous. I think the night started at like 10, and then have this go till 2 a.m. and then meeting folks in the city. It was like a second life, and it was great. I think it kept me sane.
What kind of music were you spinning?
We first started out with Afrobeat, actually. There was a place across the street that was doing a lot of like top 40 kind of stuff. And we thought, it'd be fun if we did Afrobeat and Motown sets and like create a kind of a different vibe that was a little bit more artistic in terms of the sound and everything. We quickly started playing Justin Bieber and whatever the people that came into the place wanted, and realized that that was the best way to remain employed. As cool as we thought we were, people just wanted like the red meat. So we ended up giving them, I think I joked at one point, I was like, I think we're just called DJ Sellout. Like we're just here for the people.
Did you have an actual name for your DJ duo?
Yeah, we were called Jerome and the Thunder Progeny, which was already a problem, right? It's too complicated, but it was my dad's name. And my friend Tim's father's name was, in the college, he was called the Thunder. And so we started, we did these gigs, and my dad actually showed up at one point. he was at like a formal event in Charlottesville, and he like shows up, I think in a tuxedo, and he just comes in and he's like, "I'm Jerome," and everyone was like, "That guy's awesome." So it was a fun scene. And like I said, I met my wife there in that whole world, and led to two awesome kids and a nice family.
Who was the historian you wanted to study with that drew you to Charlottesville?
A guy named Ed Ayers, who was and still is, I think, one of the best Southern historians in the country. He was studying the history of the American South. I had been teaching in Savannah, Georgia, in a Southern public school just outside the city of Savannah, in a really tough district where kids were coming with all sorts of problems and issues. And I felt completely unprepared to deal with the crisis of public education in the United States, especially in the region that I was from, the American South. And so I was like, I want to go like figure this out. Why are schools so bad? Obviously there were things like segregation, all these things that I knew were part of the problem, but I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So the guy to work on this type of stuff was Ed Ayers. And so I went up there. Interestingly, right before that, our mutual friend, Aaron, I tried to cross country on bicycle with Aaron. And
I've heard a little bit about this.
It's a short story because
it's certainly not a coast to coast story. What went down?
We did everything wrong. We both, Aaron and I, were the types of people who were big dreamers, but not the best planners when it came to like figuring out how we're going to actually do this big thing we wanted to do. So I was a big mountain biker. I grew up in Atlanta, which had surprisingly, for people that aren't from there, a pretty big mountain biking scene. And so I had a mountain bike, a Trek 3500 or something like that. And that was the bike I was going to choose to try and cross country on. So right then, you've clearly made poor choices. But I was teaching, so it was the teacher's schedule. I wanted to do it in the summer, so it's going to be hot. And I didn't have a lot of cash, so like I thought we'd just start where we are and then fly back. And so we were going from Bainbridge, Georgia, southern Georgia, across the Florida Panhandle, east to west, into the wind about 90% of the days that we were out there. And I just remember one distinct moment where we're biking along the beach, basically, and it's just this headwind that is like so extreme that I was just pedaling as hard as I could, and we were unsupported, so we had our panniers and everything. It was a lot of weight, and just the resistance from the wind was incredible, and I just felt like I wasn't moving. And I just remember turning to Aaron, I just grabbed the bicycle and just chucked it into the dunes and was like, fuck it, like this is ridiculous. And I should also say that the year before that, I had tried to paddle to the Gulf Coast by myself. From Atlanta, Georgia, there's a river called the Flint River that goes all the way down to Apalachicola Bay. And I was a big whitewater kayaker, so I had this Dagger kayak, and I had it all loaded down with gear. I was so ill prepared then too. I like show up at the spot to put in, and I didn't have any shoes. Like I had just gotten so excited about the whole adventure, and I remember my dad was dropping me off, and he's like, "Hey man, where's your like shoes? You're gonna be gone for like weeks." And I was like, "Oh, I don't have any. We'll just figure it out."
You didn't just go home and get shoes.
It was too like we had already driven all the way down to this like put in point, and like I did it, and I think about some of the people you've talked to. I've listened to some of the podcasts. They've done some pretty incredible things. Just didn't execute, just didn't even like think through it. And maybe part of it was just didn't have the drive to like push through and just like get there. I think I stayed on the river for like 2 weeks. It was still a lot of time by yourself doing that kind of paddling. But long story short is I remember getting to Virginia, and one of the first things I was telling them these stories, you're relaying your biography to your new mentors. And one of the professors at UVA was like, "It sounds like you have completion issues. Like, is this going to be a problem for you?" And I'm happy that I proved them wrong, made it through the PhD.
Yeah, I mean, everything's a problem until it's not a problem, or you have a problem completing things until you're writing books or whatever the case may be, right?
Yeah.
So for you with those earlier experiences, you know, it's interesting. I was interviewing another person who's going to be on a future episode of the show, Lindsay Dyer, who's a big mountain skier, really famous, has done a lot of incredible things. And she shared an anecdote related to water, actually. I won't spoil it. But with your experience with kayaking, I feel like people who are pretty seriously into that at some point usually have some kind of experience with getting pinned down. And did that ever happen to you?
On that trip, I mean, of many moments I've had, that I remember it was Yellow Jacket Shoals, which was this is not a big whitewater river. I had grown up paddling at the Natahala Outdoor Center. I'd gone and done like training. I was really committed to it. And when I was in high school, I did, or I think going into college, was a kayak instructor in Georgia and was like really passionate about whitewater paddling. But I think in part because of the training, like I went to this place that was all about understanding dangers on a river, you know, and understanding and really overemphasize this whole point of like looking at a rapid or a portion of the river and deciding like, and being cool with being like, I'm going to pass today. I just don't feel like I've got it. And I felt like I really imbibed that part of it almost to the extreme. I look at people that were doing things, you know, I've been paddling since I was probably 13, 12 years old. In terms of skill set and years of experience, I watch people do things that have far less experience and they're doing it. And part of me is like envious, but then part of me is like, it's kind of dumb. You know, do they even have like a real solid role, you know? So I was always very cautious, but when I did this trip, you know, one of the worst things you can do is go paddling by yourself. But part of this was like I was really struggling with my identity. I'd come out of undergrad. I'd worked in Washington, D.C. with our friend Aaron. And I left this job at White & Case, this big international law firm, after like 9 months. And I think I told the person there, I was like, I feel like my soul is like being crushed. I need to figure this out.
Why did it feel like that?
In looking back on it now, I realized I had no independence. I was kind of doing whatever was being asked of me by some person higher up in that kind of corporate model, right? And that just was clearly not something I wanted to do. And I had all these, when I was younger, I was interested in religion, being a pastor, I think, even when I was really young. And I don't have any aspirations in that.
Where did that come from? Was that your family? Or?
Yeah, you know, growing up in Georgia, you're in the Bible Belt, and my grandfather was a primitive Baptist minister. My you know, everybody in my family was religious, and so the thing that I knew I wanted to do was do something good in the world. And at that time, you know, helping people find religion and things sounded like the most important thing you could do. Over time, I realized I had other missions and that faded. I think environmental issues became kind of a replacement for that drive. But it was always there. It was like your life should have purpose. When you work, it should be towards some kind of common good, towards the public good. And I joke, one of our friends said one day when he saw me in teaching at Ohio State, he said, well, I got your congregation, you know? And he knew me for so long that I think he had this sense of, he could see the through line, you know? But for me, I think I didn't fully connect the dots.
And I know this isn't the area of focus for your research or what you write about, but something that's popping into my mind right now is that there's been a cultural convergence of the environment, plants, and religion. I feel like that's a very prevalent current in culture right now. And, you know, whether it's ayahuasca, psilocybin, and I mean, psilocybin now being commercialized, and a lot of other plants, plant medicine. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would say for whatever reason, I'm attracted to a group of friends that are kind of playing in the space and thinking a lot about it. Mushrooms, for example, and the possibilities. Michael Pollan, I remember when I was writing Citizen Coke, I my first book, which was on the history of Coca-Cola and its environmental impact around the world, he was at Berkeley, and I was there as a postdoc. And as a food writer, I thought it'd be nice to meet him. And sure enough, he had office hours at Berkeley, which is kind of cool. It's like, here's this super famous writer. And I just thought it was so cool. He had like these 2-hour block. And I think I signed up for a slot and knocked on the door, and he opened the door and he said, "Hey, I'm Michael." I think I said like subtly, like, "Pollen," like it was just, I was just kind of starstruck. And, he took me under his wing actually in that meeting and talked a lot about like writing and other things, actually about writer's insurance and how to protect yourself from getting sued. I didn't even know writer's insurance existed.
I didn't either.
Yeah.
I was a journalist for over a decade. I probably should have had that, because I did get subpoenaed a couple of times.
Wow. For what?
For things that people said in interviews, in which I was the interviewer. People tried to drag me into court cases because caused problems in their marriages or other things. Famous people.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, which leads, I don't want to get off track, but there's something, it's an anxiety. I think what I was learning from Pollen at that point is this was live. This was real. I know that sounds weird, but as a writer at that time, before you're really out there, you're thinking about it as almost a kind of, it's abstract. It's not real. But then when you write about a company like Coca-Cola and they get angry, you're like, oh my gosh, like my life could be jeopardized and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, he was just somebody I really respected. And when he came out with the book, How to Change Your Mind, and I got to kind of actually listen to a lot of him discussing the book, I was really blown away. He struck me as a person, as a writer. He always said that he wanted to write as somebody who was learning about something as an amateur, which is kind of cool. Like, the best writing is somebody who's not necessarily an expert in the field, but who's going on this journey to learn. And so there's a long way of saying that I'm really moved by his experience in that book. It sounds like he found, whether it be through his experience with learning about mushrooms and learning about these different plants, that there's this wild connection we can have with whatever we want to call it, the magical energy that unites this planet and universe, that I'm really intrigued by. But go back to the beginning of the story. I was so prudish growing up. I grew up in a very conservative state, in a very conservative family. And I still think I'm subconsciously shirking or getting rid of some of that fear of doing something bad, And when I think about some of these plant products versus like a shot of 151 or something, I'm like, this is way healthier for you and probably is better for you. But it's hard to beat out those years and years of kind of being taught that these things were dangerous and terrible for you and everything else.
Yeah, and we're going to jump around a lot. And I also should note that this is the first time that I've sat down to interview someone face to face in 30 months. And, staring at other human beings is awesome. It's different. And you're going to hear some different sounds. You might hear the sounds of ice and metal cups. I'll note that they're metal. We're not using any plastic. No, up to 30% plant matter plastic bottles. We're not going to burn any plastic following this interview. But just to jump around a little bit, is I hear you talking about those different topics, plant medicine, religiosity, your experience of nature that you shared a bit with kayaking, and it sounds like also with cycling. Whether somebody's going to see Shaman Bob to have an ayahuasca trip somewhere in the Berkeley Hills, or they're going to Peru to do that, or somebody going out to paddle, or as we did before this interview, we went and walked around in my garden and we picked some berries. There is something powerful and transformative about the power of nature. And how does that inform your life experience or what you're drawn to as a writer and researcher?
It was there from the very beginning. I think of kind of the title of your podcast and the mission of some of the things you talk about. I should not be a writer. You can hear that I even feel uncomfortable talking about it because I can't remember this time very well. And as a historian, I want to be factually accurate in everything I say. So I'll phrase it this way. As a kid, my family told me that I was dyslexic, like severely dyslexic. And people bat this word around, dyslexia, like, okay, I am dyslexic. I write fives backwards. In my case, it was like extreme. And I do remember it well enough to be like, yeah, it seemed crazy. I went to the school, special school in Atlanta that like worked with folks that were deaf and had speech impediments and in my case, dyslexia. It changed everything. The one thing I probably shouldn't do, or people back then would have said, is write books. You know, people that have problems with dyslexia don't do that. And so I think I leaned into that because it was the thing I was worse at. I wasn't good at it. And I think it stuck in my craw, so to speak. And I wanted to prove, one could ask to who, I don't know, myself, others, that I could do it. But related to this is the question you had. Because I wasn't good at school and because I wasn't a good writer, I was constantly wanting to do physical things because I was good at those things. You know, we mentioned cycling and the paddling and all that stuff, but also, you know, basketball was huge to me. I was a huge basketball player. I tore my ACL twice. No, I feel like part of the podcast is just hearing people's injuries, and all of us have them, you know. But sharing those stories is critical because I think those injuries are these like pivotal moments, right? I got turf toe, of all things, playing basketball. It disconnected my tendons from my right toe to my foot. Just tore up my body, basketball did. But in those years of the ACL being torn, you can't use your knees, you can't use your legs. Kayaking and other things kind of take over. And so my point here is that the outdoors was a space where, as somebody who was dyslexic and had all these issues, nature was a space in which I could just feel natural. I could feel talented. And I gravitated to those spaces because of that. But I think once you're in it, you're paddling down the Chattooga River in a beautiful day, you can't help but be moved by that space and say, that was the seed of me years later saying I want to be an environmental historian, you know, who fights to protect these spaces that really can't speak for themselves. And I think the reason I would write is because of that nagging, I'm not good at this. So let me show people I'm good at this. I still remember even in high school, the same high school I went to with our mutual friend, Aaron, you know, this English teacher being like, he's not good enough to be bumped up to the next level. And I just remember being like, I'm going to do it. Like, give me a shot, you know? And so, I think the fact that I'm a writer makes sense given that history, why I chose that path, knowing myself now. And I think the reason I do environmental stuff, to your point, is because that was a space I was drawn to because of those limitations, one could argue, or whatever, dyslexia. And then I quickly saw that that's what I wanted to fight for. And waking up every day and doing this kind of work, it's like, I wish it for everybody that they could have that. I mean, it's like a mission that feels worthy of getting up at 6 o'clock and going to work every day. So there's a lot of luck, but I think I just listened to myself, I guess, and ended up doing this kind of work.
When you were a kid and you learned that you had dyslexia, other than you were having the experience of what happened when you tried to read or write, but when you were told that, do you recall how that felt?
I don't. You know, that's the biggest thing for me is I told you I grew up in Georgia, and in Georgia, I always call it big fish stories, you know. Everyone tells stories that are a little exaggerated. And so I would say that part of my journey, even to this moment right now, is I want to go back to those records. I want to see how bad it was, because I kind of can't believe it that I was able to get through it. But there's a part of me that does believe it, because I know that teachers changed everything. And I know that so many people did not get that opportunity that I got to get diagnosed. I was really young. I don't know the age, but, you know, kindergarten-ish. And those folks working with me, I have these like flashbulb memories, right, of being in a a room. And I just remember writing, I just gave that example of the 5 being backwards, which is, again, not the whole story, but I remember just writing the 5, like with one teacher, right? And that kind of privilege, if you will, to have that kind of education. And then, of course, going to the Savannah story, watching kids who didn't have that, often Black students, from really tough backgrounds, in a school that was completely understaffed, where they had a 22-year-old teaching them for the first time, who had no concept of understanding mental health or any of the training that you need, I think, to help people through that, and being like, this is messed up, And so, it's still a journey for me to figure out what was it really like? Because to me, I feel like I read like you read. I don't really enjoy it in the way that, like, people that I see, it makes me so jealous when I'm watching people just reading, and this is supposed to be my job, and yet, like, it's work. But I love knowledge, and that's the way to get it, is to read. So, I just can't remember that period well enough to know how bad it was. I know I didn't feel like I was really smart. And I remember what that felt like. And I still am an imposter. I still have huge imposter syndrome, which I am talking more about now. But for a long time, I wouldn't even mention, because it was like, if I talk about this, then maybe everything will get taken away, Yeah. And I don't know if it'll ever go away, weirdly.
How does that show up for you now?
Sometimes when I'm sitting around with a bunch of academics, I won't speak up because I still feel like I'm not good enough to do it, You could argue on the positive side, it's one of the reasons I love being in the classroom with students. Because there's a vulnerability that they show and that I'm willing now to show, like I used to try and just tell students things that, and fudge through it, like, oh yeah, I kind of know. And now I'll just be like, I don't know the answer to that, and for some reason, that space to me now is like the most comfortable space in which I can operate. It's around young people where I can kind of be like, I don't have all the answers. I know you're on a journey, you're learning, I'm learning too. Let's learn together. And that feels really good, to have a place that you feel so comfortable in, So that's the positive side. But yeah, definitely around certain academic circles, I still feel like that we all have the lump in your throat kind of experience.
Yeah. When you were on Joe Rogan's podcast, you were sharing about your experience as you started to, it sounds like your thesis became your Coke book.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of that, it sounds like you were learning reporting techniques and what we might more broadly call human intelligence, like working with people, because as you know, there's a lot of social engineering involved in reporting, working with sources, getting people to disclose information to you. How did you acquire all of those skills?
Friends, who really showed me how to do this work. I ended up being a fellow at a place called New America, which is in Washington, D.C., a think tank. And a lot of writers for the New Yorker were there. A lot of folks that worked in the New York Times or the Washington Post. And Patrick Radden Keefe was one of our fellows. And I remember sitting in this room. It was like this starstruck moment. Go back to the imposter syndrome, and you're sitting around with a writer for New Yorker. And you're a kid who grew up thinking, there was literally a homeroom when I got to 6th grade that now looking back, you can see it in the yearbook. It was the kids who were struggling, and my friends now point that out. They do it with jest. There's a part of it that still kind of hurts. It's like, you can see it. Like, this guy was not supposed to be smart, And then you're sitting around with some of the world's best writers. And so I think the good thing about feeling that kind of imposter syndrome is you listen. You don't feel like you have all the answers. it's a strength in a way, because you're just like, I want to learn how that person does what they're doing. And I want to ask them, and it wasn't a false sense of modesty, because it's just, you literally feel like you're lesser than, like, hey, tell me how you do this. And I still remember that one journalist, Phil Sands, who, like, I remember calling him in a grocery store and being like, hey, I've got this source that is really sensitive. Like, how do I go about this? How do I protect them? And it was that kind of stuff. Just people, we didn't get any training in grad school for history for this stuff, that were just helping me see how to do it. And I'm so thankful for those people along the way. It's like I said about these podcasts, like, the best part about being a writer is having these interactions, and face to face. Thank goodness the pandemic, the very beginning, it was also chaotic. And now it feels like I'm getting to do some of the best parts of that, which is, seeing people and hearing their stories, and getting to relay a little bit of mine. So, yeah, I can't say enough about the journalists who kind of walk me through this stuff. I remember one of them was like, you're talking to people that are pretty sensitive. Like, are you using an encrypted phone service? And I was like, and they're like, you must begin to use this app and this type of thing, And as you experienced as a journalist too, like, the thing that was the hardest thing for me when these books came out on Coke and Monsanto, especially Monsanto, I remember it. I wasn't worried about being sued so much by Monsanto, although we can get into that. I was worried about the people that were being represented, and did I get their story right? There's one guy in there, for example, that used a fuck in one of the things he said to me, and I knew this person well enough to be like, are they going to be okay with this kind of almost crass language being in there? And I remember going back and forth with the editor, like, what do we do? What do we do? And he's like, you have to keep that fuck in there. Because if you don't do that, you're not representing how this person, who was on the record at the time and knew that they were on, was trying to convey it. And I just remember waiting, like, to hear, how do these people feel, when this came out? And I was really happy when all my sources, I think, felt like they had been represented the right way. Even if it was a little controversial, they felt like I had given them the full voice that they needed. But I don't think I would have achieved any of that without the help of journalists who kind of walked me through that process, and being true to the people you're listening to, and paying really close attention and listening well.
They don't always feel that way.
Yeah.
So we've kind of jumped into your experience with working on the books, and what was your process for getting to the specific topics? Because, you kind of give us the story of how you got into the academic world. Why did you gravitate towards the topic of Coca-Cola? And then why did you gravitate to the topic of Monsanto?
For anybody that's a graduate student trying to figure out what they're going to do in life, don't worry if you're late in the process, because when I got to grad school, I told you I was going to write about public schools in the South. But then I took this course my second year of grad school called Environmental History, Global Environmental History. Environmental History. I was like, that sounds awesome. Given what I've just told you, right? I've committed to being this historian and writer. I've been passionate about the environment since my days in the Whitewater years. And that was it. I was hooked. But look, I'd come to work with one of the best Southern historians in the country, and I was like, oh no. Like, am I going to abandon this dude who bet everything on me, to be a student and come in? And so I had to have a hard conversation with him, like, hey, I'm an environmental historian now. I'm not a Southern historian. And the best thing, you think about great mentors in your life, is just people that give you that freedom to grow. And he didn't stop it a bit. It was like, great, go do it. But because he was a Southern historian, I was thinking about Southern products that changed the world. And so and being from Atlanta, I was like, and there you go. There's my messianic complex, the pastor complex of like, I want this to matter. I want it to be big. What's the big impact when we think about environmental footprints? And strangely, multinational firms were not a big focus of environmental history. Like, it was political history, it was different things. But so it was like this great window. I was like, I want to write about huge corporations and their environmental footprint. And because I was doing the South, Coke was just sitting there. And I was like, oh man, that's perfect. 1.9 billion servings of their product every day. Like, how did they do it? And so everybody who'd written about Coca-Cola had written about the marketing and advertising, like Santa Claus, they did a great job of selling themselves as like connected to Christmas and everything else. And I was like, that's great, but you need like hundreds of millions of pounds of sugar. You need, they're the largest consumer of caffeine on the planet. How did they get all that stuff at such low cost that they could be everywhere? That was the environmental history question. It was great because the map of the book was easily laid out. It was like, all right, let's look at each ingredient that goes into the product and figure out how they got this stuff. And that relates to the second book because I was just tracing these stories. How do they get sugar? And how do they get it at such low cost? How do they get coca leaves, which is still in the drink? It's one of its secret ingredients. Like, how do they get all this stuff? And it was when I got to caffeine, I was really stumped. I was like, whoa, how do they source their caffeine? And that journey led me to the corporate archives of a little known company called Monsanto in St. Louis. It was Monsanto that from 1901 onwards was providing caffeine to Coca-Cola. And they were doing it by taking the waste tea leaves that were left over at tea exchanges around the world, the garbage of the tea industry, and turning that waste into caffeine. Because even though nobody was drinking those broken and damaged tea leaves that were on floor tea exchange, you could sweep it up, process out this really powerful drug, and put it in the drink. And Monsanto gave me access to their records. And that was like, whoa.
Did they have to do that?
No. You had to ask for permission.
Why do you think they did that?
I think they assumed that what was in there had already been vetted by lawyers and therefore was clean and pristine. But because of all the things we've talked about, like experience with journalists and experience, I would also say in history, and as you know from writing, when you have a treasure trove of 300 boxes like that, no matter how squeaky clean they are, there's triangulations you make. There's references to a town. There's references to a person. Then maybe the next document's missing or something. But that's all you need to then go on the journey to leave the archives and be like, okay, I'm going to go to Soda Springs, Idaho, where they produce Roundup to see what's going on. And it was like the craziest experience ever, radioactive waste being generated as a byproduct of making this herbicide, and like the story I never would have found. So that was critical to the second book, was having that access.
Part of what blew my mind when I was listening to the Rogan interview and hearing you talk about some of these same topics is that no one had done this before.
Yeah. I mean,
how did that, it always amazes me when there is a large scale, amazing, mind-blowing story kind of hiding in plain sight, but you need to go one degree further with your investigation to get to it. Right. And
yeah,
not to diminish anything that you did, but like you pushed into a space that no one else had done before, and you unlocked something no one else had.
I appreciate that. I mean, I do think that environmental history was the key. Because it's a relatively young field, environmental history has been around since the 70s, but it's really taken off like in the last several decades. It combines environmental science with history, I should say. It's basically the history of how humans reshape nature, but also how nature acts as an agent in history, like tornadoes and things like that. And so the cool thing is you can look at anything, like the Civil War, through the lens of environmental history. It's like, whoa, there's all these other things we weren't even thinking about because we were so focused on like, what was Robert E. Lee doing? And, the battle military history kind of angle, which is useful, but it's like, okay, why are they going to Gettysburg in the first place? And it turns out there's like this natural resource story. Like they've completely devastated the Virginia landscape in the north. They're out of provisions. They need to find new resources. So they're going north, So in other words, it helps you rethink all these things that you think you know. And it's just like, pick a topic. And the American Revolution, and rethink it through the lens of what were the ecological factors that might have been reshaping this. And that's what's so fun about it. It's like, as you said, you're just rediscovering these things that we think we knew. And I think that's the best part about doing history. My advisor went off to do his PhD. His mother, who was a school teacher, said to him, "Why, baby? We already knew what happened," And I think that's how people think about history. But the truth is, it's this discourse, this conversation. We don't really know what happened. We're still trying to figure it out. And I love that aspect of it. It feels like you're kind of seeing things afresh. So people had written about Monsanto, but maybe not with the specific lens of environmental history, which was great.
Part of what really struck me about the Monsanto story is what I might call creeping incrementalism. So it's just making, from the point of view of a company that's trying to maximize profits for its shareholders, it's simply looking at its inputs and trying to take one more step to extract more value over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And there's an adjacent issue I wanted to talk about there, but because, you know, people forever have talked about like big evil corporations. There's the movie, The Corporation. But as you got into this, like, what was the intent that you sensed behind what was happening and the why of why it was happening?
Yeah, these are great questions, because that mattered so much to me. I knew my brother lived in Alaska when I was writing this, and he sent me a bumper sticker when I started the book that said "Mon Satan," you know, and it was just understood. I knew going in this was, why even write it? Everyone knows they think they know it's an evil corporation, all these terrible things. Like, what's new to learn? And to me, I wanted to suggest that this was a human story, that there were people in here who had kids and families and various things. And like, why, if we can learn history in a way that shows how good people, as you said, incrementally kind of fall into these decisions that lead to these often catastrophic consequences. Whoa, that's a lesson for our own time and for ourselves. Because almost anybody looking back says, I wouldn't have done that. You know, I'm a good person. That's how we look at history. If we teach history the right way is look, here's how this person was able to kind of get themselves stuck into this position of making a decision that we can now see was wrong. That's helpful history. But I want to be clear. There were also moments in this book where people just made the most unethical, shitty decisions. And I felt like that was also an obligation of mine, not just to tell the story of these human characters who were doing these things that were very slow, but led to these problems. There were also moments where people just chose evil, you know? And I feel like the historian's job is to do both, like to hold people accountable. Because a lot of people say in the 50s and 60s, they just didn't know better. Our job as historians is to say, what did they know? Because if we can show that they knew things back then that could have prevented problems, I mean, that has legal implications. It has all sorts of implications that can lead to compensation and maybe some degree of redemption for people that have been harmed by chemicals or other things. And that's what's so weird. That was what was so weird about writing this book. All these cases that started emerging in which the book became a source base for people to draw on as they tried to figure out what did the company know and when did they know it. And that was a bit, I don't want to say it was unexpected, but the degree to which it became part of that conversation has been really interesting. You know, to where the documents I uncovered are part of a current conversation about, well, what is the obligation that Bayer, that owns Monsanto now, this German company that bought Monsanto in 2018, what's their obligation to deal with these problems of the past? And to come full circle on this, as somebody who grew up wanting to have meaning and purpose and to do good and to try and think about like works that could have impact, that feels really good. And to have done it in a way that's not, you know, it's not a polemical piece. It's just trying to lay out the story as best I can using those archival documents and letting those voices, documents kind of have power in our own time today, which is kind of cool.
And people should definitely check out both books. I'll put links in the show notes. And the Rogan interview is definitely worth listening to as well, because you go in pretty deep on all these topics. And on that topic of incrementalism, please correct me if I get this wrong, but Monsanto started out with Agent Orange, then went from Agent Orange to Roundup, right? Mm-hmm. And Roundup is glyphosate.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, the first time that I heard about glyphosate, I'd probably had read about it in, you know, major media sources, but John Joseph from the Cro-Mags has a YouTube channel, and, you know, he's a vegan. He also has interesting views on certain topics, but one of the things he went off on in one of his videos was glyphosate. And I started to look into it, and then I started to, you know, of course I try to eat as much organic food as possible and everything. But, you know, you start to look around and then suddenly you're like, wow, this isn't It's in everything. And one of the things that struck me, I was just trying to get oats, like, make sure that I was getting oats that like didn't have Roundup in them. But there is a question hiding in here. And my question is, it seems like Monsanto was trying to do that again because they had a certain set of inputs. They were trying to turn them into something to enable agriculture at scale. And if not, I guess my question is, if not that, then what is a different or better way? And I know that you're more into the investigation of what happened, but what is the alternate path for large scale corporate agriculture?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, just to put fine points on this, when Monsanto starts out in 1901, it's actually doing nothing in ag. It's basically creating saccharin for Coca-Cola, which was another connection, by the way, to my other project. And it takes them a long time. It's really the 40s and 50s that they get into agricultural chemicals, partially because ag is changing. And I think this goes to your point. This is post-World War II. There's a very big war and nature story here, that the military kind of mindset of both World War II and the Cold War is shaping how we think about food production, chemical usage, and all these things. In fact, most of these chemicals, 2,4-D, which was one half of Agent Orange, the other half was 2,4,5-T, these wonky names, right, for these chemicals. That's the other half of Agent Orange. It's 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. These were all coming out of these military campaigns to try and figure out how we could have these defoliants that could help soldiers fight more effectively in jungle environments. It's a war against nature mindset, right? Like, let's annihilate this landscape. And these chemicals are coming out of that philosophy. So kind of to your point, I think obviously when we think about how do we change our food system for the better, we can think about the small things like, or we can think about the kind of granular level of saying, okay, we've got to move away from things like 2,4-D, which, by the way, are consistently being used even today on farms to grow food. I mean, this is a chemistry that goes back to the 1940s, 2,4-D, and yet it's still being used. Glyphosate, as you said, comes out in the 1970s after the Agent Orange debacle. I mean, talk about incremental. The whole point was they were saying, look, Agent Orange is really toxic. We now know that. I show in the book that they knew it a lot earlier. And to me, that was personal, by the way. My father served in Vietnam, and, seeing documents that showed they knew about problems with Agent Orange as early as 1949. It wasn't called Agent Orange then, but these chemicals going back to 2 decades before. It's just a gut punch, when you're like, think about all the people that wouldn't have had to be affected by this if the company had just said, we got a problem here. We probably should shut down production and figure something out. But it took them until the 70s and all the pressure and all the realizations, the public exposure, for them to move into Roundup. But that mindset of war against nature, born of the 40s and 50s, when chemical ag really takes off, I think is the philosophical problem with the food system. Like this mindset that like, you've got to freaking burn it down. I mean, it's literally, when you talk about oats, that's literally the language, like the burn down, right? This just leveling of weeds and just clearing the fields with chemicals. Making a food system that's going to work for the future, that's sustainable, that doesn't expose us to chemicals that are now over a half century old, in some cases 75 years old, I think involves confronting that history, that these were all products that were coming out of that kind of, we've got to annihilate. I mean, it was very much a product of a nuclear age, an atomic age. And this, some might say this is overly academic, but I can't help but think that if you're going to fix everything on the ground level, you've got to start with that philosophical recognition of how this didn't have to be the way it is. It came out of a specific historical context, a wartime context. And if we can reimagine that, I think we can do great things. I, for example, hang out with farmers who are like, I really don't need glyphosate. Even though people are like, you've got to use glyphosate in order to like feed the world. And I think it's an open secret. I've traveled to Brazil and everywhere else. When you talk to people that are doing this, using glyphosate to the extreme that they're using it, they're like, this isn't about feeding the world. This is about producing more and more soybeans or corn and doing so in a way that generates a certain profitability for large scale farms. And it's more about those economics now than it is about how do we feed a growing population and do it in a way that doesn't expose people to harmful chemicals and harms the land. So Bayer and Monsanto will say, we need chemicals, we need to do these things because we need to increase per acre yields. But it's just, that's part of the lie. But that's the answer. Productivity is the way we're going to feed everybody. That's just not true.
That's part of what another aspect of this that intrigues me. And I'm thinking in particular about how the war in Ukraine is impacting commodity prices around the world right now. And doing research for this podcast and hearing you speak on this topic, is it a lie that we are not capable of producing enough food to feed the world in the absence of these petrochemical derived fertilizers or weed killers, whatever we might call them?
I think it is. I think you got to remember that I live in Ohio, so I spend a lot of time with farmers. And you talked about the incremental nature of this story, and I added this component of trying to tell a human story. To pivot is going to be hard. Largely because if you spend any time with farmers, and I have, there's a system in place. And it's structured in a certain way. And there's a kind of expectation that this is the way you're supposed to do things. And everything's been retooled to kind of have this model of, especially when you think about commodity crops, buying crops that are Roundup ready. That means genetically engineered to be able to tolerate glyphosate. That, by the way, started in 1996. So we're at the 25th anniversary of genetically modified crops in the United States.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, GMOs. One of the things I want to do in this book was be fair to the farmers who fell into this system and explain why they did it. It's not like they're dumb. If you spend time with farmers, some of those people are brilliant. And they did so because it made sense at the time. Imagine this. You can grow soybeans, cotton, corn, whatever, and you can spray this chemical glyphosate on your crops, but they've been genetically engineered to tolerate it. So it kills all the weeds and your crops survive. Wow. I don't have to go out there and scout for weeds as much as I used to. I don't have to spray, by the way, all these other chemicals we talked about that are older than glyphosate that have more toxic profiles. So all I need is glyphosate. And that's going to save me money. This sounds great. But what we see from the historical record very clearly is by the end of the 90s, early 2000s, nature fights back. And that's the story of environmental history that's so key. What you recognize is that nature is incredibly adaptive. And think about that time frame. 1996 is the first introduction of genetically engineered crops. By the end of the 1990s, we already see weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. So farmers are feeling really good. They all buy in, they retool, like bigger tractors, bigger sprayers. We're doing this system. Think about that from the perspective of a homeowner. You've built your house. Everything's exactly the way you want it. It's now super revolutionary. And then all of a sudden electricity's gone. And you got to think, and by that I mean, the weed resistance comes in or something big comes in and kind of disrupts that. It's a challenge to think about how you're going to pivot because you've maybe gotten rid of some farm hands, you've scaled up, and this is the way you do things. And so when that weed resistance happened, these farmers felt really stuck. They're like, what do we do now? And Monsanto, for a while, tried to deny that resistance was even an issue, that weeds were developing resistance. I'm at Ohio State, where weed scientists, I told you about that fuck earlier, that guy who said that word was a weed scientist at Ohio State. And he was trying to convey how frustrated he was talking to the company, being like, weeds are developing resistance at a high level. All these farmers are going to be in a really tight bind. You've got to tell people this is problematic. We're spraying too much chemicals. And, they try to badger these folks. But ultimately, the cat's out of the bag. By 2005, 2006, farmers, it's clear. The weeds just aren't dying when you spray glyphosate. So Monsanto created this new seed system called Extend that would allow you to spray both Roundup and this chemical called dicamba. And the idea was, look, we've got a solution. It's a new seed. Now you can spray glyphosate. That'll kill a lot of the weeds. And you can spray dicamba. which is another herbicide, go back to the 1960s, which will kill all the other weeds that are resistant to glyphosate. Everything's fixed, And I'm looking at my iPhone right now. It's like the perfect business model. It's like, okay, you've got the iPhone 1. Well, now you need the iPhone 4. And guess what? Of course, we're seeing dicamba resistance, weeds that are developing resistance to dicamba because you're spraying so much. Go figure. We now have a seed that they're trying to develop that has resistance to 5 different herbicides. The idea being that, it can wipe out anything. But think about this. If the goal of our system, you talked about Russia and this petrochemical dependency, is to reduce our petrochemical inputs, we're going the opposite direction. We're using more and more petrochemical inputs, not less, at the very time that climate change is happening, and we're talking about trying to get rid of our fossil fuel dependency. It's as clear as day when you look at the growth of herbicide use that the future of agriculture right now is our past. It's a chemical past where we're using chemicals that are from the 40s and 50s to grow our food. I mean, a 5th grader would look at this and say, this is insane, right? And maybe it would all be worth it if the data showed that genetically engineered crops, Roundup Ready crops, were like exploding in terms of yield. Like you're just getting this massive yield boom. But that was the most surprising thing too. The National Academy of Sciences looked at crops that were genetically engineered like corn, soybeans, and mapped the yield trends for crops that were not genetically engineered. You can think of organic corn or other types of maybe even conventionally bred corn, but that doesn't have genetically engineered traits. And the yield trends map on perfectly. Like if you're thinking that when genetically engineered crops came out, like there was this spike in yield in terms of food production, the data 25 years later is so clear that that didn't happen. So we're not getting this huge yield bump, but we're getting more petrochemical dependency, not less. It's a system that's great for a company that sells chemicals, see Monsanto, but not necessarily great if we're going to feed the world.
What are weeds telling us?
I said this the other day, that sometimes in history when you mess up so badly, like you push a product so hard that it creates this kind of massive problem that we have now, which is resistance issues all over the place. This is where I'm going to be an optimist. We've been I've been, I guess, pessimistic throughout this, but I have tremendous hope for the future because I think the system was misused. So these chemicals were misused so aggressively that it screwed up this, in terms of weeds. It created these, people call them super weeds, which can be a bit of a misnomer, but the chemicals just aren't working the same way against them, which means that we have this opportunity to confront that philosophy I talked about. Like this is, frankly, for farmers, it's costing more money. And at some point, and we're seeing this, I was just on a tractor with a regenerative farmer the other day who was planting these these incredible cover crops, a variety of different cover crops, and just using those cover crops as a kind of weed suppressant and doing this whole new imaginative way of farming, which actually isn't that imaginative. It's old school practices. And he was just joking about his farmers, like, I got better yield than this guy, and I'm not using nearly as much glyphosate. He still wasn't completely chemical free, but he basically told me, he's like, I'm just using it as like a crutch every now and then. I could totally get rid of it. In other words, farmers are seeing they can do this and they can do it profitably. Journals like Nature and others are coming out with this, that the data is clear. That's what's beautiful about being at 25 years, right? As a historian, it's like, okay, we can look back and see if these promises hold true. And farmers are just saying, I can do better by not using these chemicals, by doing crop rotations, using cover crops, paying attention to soil health, and thinking about how I can generate healthier soil and also a farmland that retains water. All these different things that were overlooked when we got into this period of just let's spray it, and be done with it, and this kind of large scale mechanized farming. So I'm extremely hopeful. Because the company was pushing these chemicals so hard, weeds adapted in a way that's forcing farmers to rethink what they're doing. So if you're wondering like, oh man, we're screwed, I actually think it's the opposite. I think they screwed it so badly that farmers are changing. what they're doing for the better, which is great.
The question that I'm thinking about, which is, it might just be so simple that, but I don't know the answer to it, and maybe you do, but there are humans, there's agriculture, the world needs to be fed, people need to be fed, but just if we were in just like a state of nature and they're just plants, okay, and we're going to have, I don't know, they're going to be fruit trees, they're going to be things that if there were humans they could eat. Let's say it's the dinosaur times. We're going Joe Rogan here, full Rogan. Right. I want to talk about Rogan and why he didn't ask you about dinosaurs. Also want to get into beefalo in a minute. But what role do weeds play just in a state of nature? Why are there weeds and what do they want to do? And if you removed humans and large scale agriculture, would a balance emerge? Because it seems like what's happening is the weeds are taking over, right? So like, why are they here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it goes back. Well, there's a great book in environmental history called Ecological Imperialism that talks about how these various, what we call weeds now, were just plant life that was brought over by colonists that just so happened to grow particularly well in this temperate climate, but also in disturbed environments, like that you would find in an area where you're colonizing. But as you're getting at this, like that's the point. Like all these things are labels, weeds, pesticides as a term. It has a history. Early 20th century, they were called economic poisons. And not in a kind of like clever way to try and undermine them. It was just like, let's just call it what it is. It's a poison, that we're putting out in the environment to try and do these things. And so pesticide sounds a little bit better. Maybe it has a pests. What is a pest? Same thing with weeds. And there's a lot of discussions about that. I know people talk about, there's an invasive species. Well, what is an invasive? I'm not trying to deny there are problems with certain types of species. And look, I grew up in the South, kudzu and various crazy things that can grow, just take over trees. I am the kind of person who goes through woods where I'm from and takes a hatchet and tries to cut down vines whenever I possibly can, because I don't want them to kill the beautiful sycamores or whatever. But yeah, I think these are all, this is where we need to be. This is where the humanities helps us to recognize that none of this is just the way it is, that a weed is a weed. Can we conceive of that plant as having a purpose even? Think about cover crops. You could argue like some people would see that and be like, oh my gosh, that's just a tangled mass of mess on that farm. No, wait a minute, it's actually doing this incredible thing, or it's, once these things are plowed under, that's going to provide nutrients to the soil. This is incredible. So, and again, I will say that the 40s and 50s, this idea of war against weeds, a war against pests, came out of those military propaganda pieces of the 40s and 50s. We don't have to think of nature that way. On the other hand, I'll say this. I've grown up around copperheads and other things. I think of John Muir. He has a great diary. He's the great, environmentalist who ended up going to Yosemite and becoming kind of a titan in the fight for national parks. If you look at his diary when he traveled to the American South in the 60s and 1860s, he draws like alligators eating humans in his diary. Like he shows like these humans just getting, because he'd never seen alligators. He's from Wisconsin. He comes down, he's like, oh my God, look at these like exotic animals of the South. But what he's saying in that diary is like, nature can be intense, violent, disruptive. Like, I do think there's something healthy about recognizing that nature isn't always out to like be our best friend, which generates a certain degree of respect for it too. Like, in other words, I'm not suggesting that all weeds like could be to benefit of humans or whatever. But there's this balance between villainizing plants and coca leaves, weed. And we talked about drugs earlier. Like, all these things are culturally constructed the way we think about them. And so, I'm excited about the next several years where we think about weeds and say, wait a minute, is that really a weed or could it be useful? Or, are there other plants that we just haven't seen or paid attention to that are right in our backyard that could feed us all,
Yeah. When my son was born and I became a father for the first time, people have all kinds of different transformative experiences with childbirth. And for me, what I learned was unexpected. But the thing that really jumped out at me, or one of the things, was when he was born and arrived, immediately started crying, and we immediately wanted to take care of Sam. We didn't know his name was Sam at the time. We were like, whatever, there's this baby, it's screaming. And then I just observed that Sam found a way to get what he needed.
Yeah.
And what struck me was just this notion of like, life finds a way. Life finds a way. It persists. It does whatever it has to do to survive. You know, probably not a real novel observation, but it did really strike me. And I was like, whoa, okay. I understand something more about life than I did before. And when we were walking around in the garden earlier today and we were looking at, you know, we have a pretty modest attempt at a garden. We've got some kale out there and some other vegetables, and we have some fruit as well. But there's all these weeds, and they're just trying to take over everything, and they're trying to kill and like take up the resources that the plants that we want to have there are taking up. And I think what you've described and what has happened with Monsanto with crops, and then I feel like in a parallel way, we also see it with food production with animals, where they just need more and more and more antibiotics and other things in order to increase yields, make cows bigger.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking about an episode of Scooby-Doo. And then the same thing with humans and antibiotics, and then like antibacterial soaps, all these things, the rise of staff, for example, in hospitals, where nature just finds a way. And whatever humans try to do, just this line keeps getting moved, and it just keeps escalating and escalating and escalating. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, for example, and humans having a different kind of relationship to their food and to nature, could you just talk a bit about regenerative agriculture and what that is?
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with, we call it in engineering, biomimicry. Biomimicry being that you try through your design, and you could argue this applies to farming or to anything, engineering, like mimic nature, like mimic life-giving forces that have been on this planet for, in some cases, you know, hundreds of millions of years. Instead of seeing nature as this enemy, see it as an ally, see it as something that you can build off of. The soil is probably the best example of that. I think regenerative farmers are recognizing, like, you know, instead of spraying all these fungicides and various chemicals that basically kill life in the soil, if we nurture those microorganisms, my gosh, you know, how could food production change? And we're seeing, like I said, this regenerative farmer I was with, he showed me a soil. That's the first thing you'll see, by the way, when you go to any regenerative farm. What somebody wants to do is just show you the color of what we would call dirt, but they would call this like life-giving organism. Like, just recognizing that the soil is like this organism, like we are. We're just this vessel for all these different microorganisms. And that fundamental way of looking at farming, looking at the land, I think is going to yield all sorts of discoveries. What can microorganisms do? Can they fixate? Can they provide the new macronutrients we need for our plants, instead of having to, as you said, putting synthetic petrochemical inputs? Can we find microorganisms that can help us provide that nutrient naturally? You know, what a great thing, because it would mean we don't have to rely on fossil fuels to do that. This is the kind of logic that we're seeing, and it's inspiring. I think you mentioned antibiotics. You know, remember that Monsanto and these companies were also pharmaceutical firms. Monsanto had bought Searle in the 1980s, and which created aspartame, the artificial sweetener in all diet drinks. And, you know, they had various pharma products. And when I was talking with some of my sensitive sources that were inside the company about how they viewed their salesmanship, uninvited, they used pharma language to talk about how they sell chemicals. It's like the there's no surprise in my mind that we'd have weed resistance and antibiotic problems because the same sales philosophy was at play. Sell these chemicals as fast and as aggressively as you can, often by courting farmers like you would doctors. They you talk about sales strategy, they describe it exactly like that. Like the way a doctor is courted by a pharma person who says, hey, try this new drug and sell it to your clients, It's the same model with farmers. Get in with what they call KIPs, the key influential people. They often weren't the most wealthy farmers. They're like the farmer that was not the wealthiest, but everyone really trusted. Get them to buy the product and then let them be kind of the route to other people. And so, that logic of the pharma logic that I think we think about the crisis of opioids and things like that, that maps on perfectly to this kind of sales strategy. As I said, one of the problem with many people inside Monsanto is they saw the future of agriculture through the product pipeline of Roundup. Like, how do we sell this product and make a lot of money? It was making over half their revenues by the end of the 2000s. I don't know the exact stat, but it was just an incredibly blockbuster product for them. It was the first $1 billion herbicide in history. So they had to push it as far as they could. One last thing on milk, which you mentioned, cows. Remember that one of the first biotech genetically modified products was actually BST, which is this hormone that helped cows produce more milk. And it came out in the late 1980s. Monsanto was the creator of it. Just pause on that for a second. The argument then was, we need to produce more milk. Late 1980s, we're having a milk shortage problem, right? It's that kind of logic of productivity is the answer. Just more. When in fact, if you pause for 2 seconds, it's the opposite. We've got so much milk. We have subsidies to try and help dairy farmers and things like that, And I think that's the beauty of history. It's just, as you said, all of these things are constructed and saying, do we really need this? Or is this brilliant marketing, brilliant strategizing? As I say in the book, Monsanto was a great problem seller. They weren't a great problem solver, but they were a great problem seller. Selling the problem, food shortages, famine, and then positioning themselves as the solution. That's what they were good at. But actually fixing farming problems, often creating more problems that they then were in the position to be the solution for, as opposed to actually fixing once and for all farmers' issues. You could argue if they did that, they wouldn't need to be around, which is, I think, one of the fundamental problems with their business model. It's about always having a certain dependency. You've got to go through us if you're going to survive. That's not a way to feed the world. That's not a democratizing kind of mission.
I'm lucky enough, and I'm in a position of great privilege. I get to live somewhere beautiful. I have chickens. We could talk about the circle of life. 3 of them recently were eaten by a fox. So we've lost some of our egg production, but we get eggs from our chickens. We have our garden, which it's Maine, so it's warm, 2 months out of the year here. But I get, we're going to get some fruits and vegetables from that. I have the luxury of having a farmer about a mile up the road. They've had a homestead farm there since the late 1800s, and they raise belted Galloway cattle. And so I can just stop by there and buy beef. I know where the beef comes from. I see the quality of life the cows have. But when we think about regenerative agriculture and the population of the world, and on the one hand, you read a lot about overpopulation, then you read Elon Musk, who has a lot of interesting ideas talking about how we need to have more babies. Setting that aside, could regenerative agriculture actually work as a cost-effective solution to feed the world?
I think so. I mean, again, historians are always loath to predict the future because it's one of the things you learn in history is just all the contingencies that lead to the moment that you're at. And I have no idea what's going to be around the corner. I should mention when I went off to college, in part because I was questionable in terms of reading and all those things I talked about. I started in biochem, and I even worked at the CDC and, worked on a vaccine and, was really interested in the science of all these things. And so CRISPR, for example, pretty wild stuff, that I could have never imagined when I was 18 years old working with PCR machines. And what will happen? I don't know, in terms of that route. But it just strikes the biggest thing that I can say that's very clear when you're on the ground looking at farming and food production is just how many waste. I want to be kind to all the farmers out there. They're farming and doing hard work, but I don't know how else to put it. There's a lot of, if the goal is to feed the world, there's a lot of just wasted resources. And that includes land. I mean, just the amount of land that I saw that was dedicated to two crops, soybeans and corn. And this included going to Brazil, to the Cerrado, which, by the way, you'd mentioned winter here. The thing that struck me that was crazy was that, in the Cerrado, you don't have like a cold winter. So you've got this situation where farmers are literally planting soybeans, and then 15 minutes, they harvest their soybeans, and then 15 minutes later, they're seeding corn. There's no down season. So it's just, some of these farms, thousands of acres, it just looks like an ocean. And you're like, all this is going for feed or for, soy meal or whatever it might be. So high fructose corn syrup or whatever, right? And it's like, we have so much of this stuff that we're trying to figure out, let's turn it into ethanol to power our cars. It's like, folks, this land is so valuable. If we think about diversifying what we're growing, back to your point about meat, if we can think about how we can produce more food that's directed not just at feeding animals, but at feeding directly humans, it's a far more efficient way to feed the world, But it's fundamentally at odds of that big pharma PHARMA model of, think about it from a chemical standpoint. You don't want that model. You want to just have one type of crop where you just can spray, and that volume is what you're shooting for, So it's no surprise to me that Monsanto / Bayer today is going to say the key to this, to feed the world, is just productivity. We can just get one more bushel per acre of soybeans, the world's going to be fed well, But if you're out there in the field as I was, you're like, oh my God, this is so wasteful. It's just so wasteful. And it doesn't have to be that way. And I, like you, have a friend, Joel, who lives in Virginia, who has a farm called Free Union Grass Farm. They raise grass-fed beef. He's one of those people who's so principally driven in terms of how he runs his farm. He actually, I think, adapted some of the models from Joel Salatin from Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma. And their land is amazing. Part of it is because they're moving animals and that organic relationship between animals and land. And, that type of meat I feel good about. I think there's still a lot of animal ethics questions that we could get into, but it would take us a whole nother podcast. But there are other models of husbandry, so it's not to say that it has to be either or, but boy, are we being wasteful right now in terms of how we're using our land to grow two commodity crops instead of growing food that we can all eat.
This might be overly reductive, but if you could have a clean slate today and you could be the person who engineered the world's food supply, what's your 5-point plan?
The 5-point plan, one, never create systems that allow that demand that you go through one of maybe 6 corporations for the most critical resources you need to grow your food, which is how we are right now. I mean, again, the farmers perceive it and have perceived it over the last 25 years, especially in the United States, that they have to have these inputs because of the way they've tooled their farming and because of the messaging that they've received. This is the only way to do it, right? And because it enticed them in. It was economically smart at the time. So you just can't. You can't have dependence on petrochemicals like we do. Not from a perspective of just human health, but it's just long-term. It's a finite natural resource. You cannot base your food system on that. And as I point out in the book, I call it scavenger capitalism. The reason we did was because at the time we did it, we had so much oil. we were finding so much oil for think about 40s, 50s, the auto boom, big cars, all that stuff. And you had this waste product of the oil industry. That became all those inputs, all those pesticides. It was just left over by the oil industries. They were like, well, here's some waste. We've refined it for gasoline, which is the valuable thing we want. Here, you can have it. And Monsanto and them, they literally in the archives were like, yay, it's free. Their raw materials were free. So again, the incremental nature of this, it makes sense at the time. So that would be number one. The 5-point plan. I don't know if I'd have 5, but definitely less reliance on meat. The way that we consume is just an energy and efficient way to feed a planet. It's just the facts, stats. I think 3 would be, again, paying attention to these microclimates, where you are, what are you growing. I think of California, there's a lot of things I've seen where people are like, I'm growing these almonds like really beautifully. And one of the questions, should you be growing almonds in this place in terms of the water intensity?
Oh, it's insane.
It's like, what? Right? But that was a result of all that irrigation that was built that made it seem like it was natural to do it. In other words, like I'm always thinking about what is the best way to not have to go through either these big irrigation systems or these big corporations in order to grow your food. How can you do it in a way that represents the kind of microenvironment that you're in, that enables you to grow that food, respecting the kind of natural forces that are shaping that climate? Last example I'll give on this, so I don't have necessarily 5 points, but one would be something along the lines of like paying attention to all these different fruits and vegetation that grow in places. I think about elderberry, which has had like this huge resurgence. And we met somebody at the beach actually who was doing this in West Virginia, and like he was just like, dude, elderberry is everywhere. It just grows. Like you'd just be driving down the highway in certain parts of West Virginia. He was like, just elderberry everywhere. Seeing food, paying attention to these landscapes. Stop, thinking about these commodity crops as like feeding the world, but being like, what other types of food are out there? The pawpaw in Ohio is like a big thing. It's like native plant that's like, everyone's like, oh dude, we can have this huge pawpaw resurgence. I think that's part of the answer, is just paying attention to what's around you. And for people who are listening to this, a good book that like inspires me to do this is Aldo Leopold's book, Sand County Almanac. He just sits on his property in Wisconsin in the 1940s, and every day he just pays attention to what's happening. And he like sees this like beetle and it's going across. And he's like, oh, this bird came in and ate the beetle. And then the bird like dies and some fox comes in. And he's just, all he's doing is being awake. I recommend you read it outside and you're going to be like, you walk away. I told my students it's like being on drugs, and they're like, oh, cool. But it really is. It's like, you're just awake. You're seeing, you've probably experienced this in Maine. Like if you just spend some time and watch, it's like this consciousness forms that we've lost. And I think Leopold was trying to get us to see that we have everything right there. You just have to see it.
I mean, that's part of what we learned through our experience with the chickens, and the kids learned as well, which is the foxes showed up one day. Our chickens were very free range. They were cruising all over, having a lot of fun. I learned early on, you don't name your chickens. That's advice I received early on. We didn't name the chickens. The kids understood that someday something might come eat them, right? And we have bald eagles. We have lots of different birds of prey. We see a lot of things happen. But with the chickens, the foxes showed up one day. One of the chickens got dragged off and eaten. And then every night when I'd go out to check on the chickens, and we started keeping them in a more contained, caged area outside. But, I'd take my flashlight out and scan the perimeter. We have a lot of deer that live in the forest behind us, but I started to see different sets of eyes. I was like, oh, that doesn't look like a deer. Foxes.
Yeah.
And then we started to look into that and talk to people locally, and they're like, oh yeah, that's because the foxes all had their babies. So they're out hunting right now. And then I talked to another parent I know who has more of a working farm. He was like, yeah, they'll like come up in the middle of the day and kill a chicken in front of you. You need to, I was like, oh, okay. It's like, that's pretty bold, but I didn't know that about foxes. I thought they were just nocturnal. So we learned all these different things. And if people who are more savvy and tuned into nature than I am are probably like, yeah, you idiot, that's how it works. But I'm just a guy who's lived in cities my whole life who's now playing around with animals, right? But yeah, just to shift gears slightly, I don't know if this is something you're working on right now and whether you can talk about it or not, but I have heard you mention the environmental impact of banking and that being something that you're looking into. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah. So this book finished on Monsanto, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. Bayer, by the way, has reached out to me after the book came out, and it was like this really like jarring moment where I thought it was, are they going to sue me because I wrote this book? And it turns out that they wanted to talk because, as they put it, they learned a lot, and I'm taking them at their word. See what happens there. And so I felt like I had this, I trained so hard to write about businesses, which is hard to do with history. You think about most historical works, it's like oftentimes people end up at a historical society where they've kept the records and they want you to see it because they're like, hey, we want you to tell the story of our town or whatever. In my case, it's like combative, like most of the time. Monsanto was the exception. They're like, you cannot have access to the records and things like that. So I started out, I was like, you know what, I've learned all these tricks of the trade. I want to write about businesses. And I've been writing about Walmart. I've been writing about FedEx. I've been writing about, in this new book I'm just about to finish next week, Coca-Cola again, I revisited, and Bank of America, and Walmart, if I did mention that. So, there's a connection to all those, but the Bank of America one was the most interesting because I was thinking, I never thought about the environmental history of banking, like I don't even think we really think that much about the environmental footprint of a bank. And when I started on it, I was like, what are the possibilities? Like maybe just looking at the cash, like what is the environmental footprint of like printing dollars, the credit card, I was like, is the plastic, what about the ATMs, like the electricity use? How about the mainframe computers that control all this? And I was like, it was fun. I was just like, again, uncharted territory. Like nobody's written about this stuff. So I was like, this is great. But it turns out that I've gotten more aggressive in like trying to track down interviews. So I just reached out to the former CEO of the company, Hugh McCall, and he's just like, come talk to me. I'm happy to chat about it. And so I went to Charlotte, went to the headquarters, went up to his office. He had grenades all over his table, which I think was designed to intimidate me. It was just like more like strange because I was like, are these live things or like, and I think he wanted it to just be like, it could be, and so, very like high finance, Wall Street kind of behavior. And I just started out on this cool line of questioning, like, so tell me about like your achievements in terms of sustainability at Bank of America. And it was like literally like hitting a head against the wall. Now he was CEO in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It was like he would go in on social, what we might think of as like social justice issues, like figuring out how to provide more lending equity to Black communities and other things. And that was really interesting. But like on environment, it was like, and I really wasn't focused on that. And that made me think, holy cow, here's a bank that controls trillions of dollars in assets, trillions now. How the heck? If we can think of environmentalism as no longer fighting to shut down that one factory or plant, but think about these conduits of capitalism like banks, could that type of environmentalism create the change we need in the short period of time, given climate change, that could really radically change the world? And I'm convinced it could. That, in other words, because banks have become so powerful, especially commercial banks, over the last 20, 30 years, if you can cut off the supply of capital to these polluting firms, then you can target the regulation more directly instead of having to go after every little plant that's got a violation of Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. And I'm really intrigued by this. And then I started learning about Elizabeth Warren's campaigns and some of the things she was proposing. And I was like, whoa, they're thinking about reforming the Dodd-Frank Act to not just have provisions in terms of predatory lending, which came out of the 2008 financial crisis, but what if you could include regulatory provisions that address climate change in those financial regulations? Could you see pivots, changes overnight? And I was like, whoa, this is super cool. And then I started realizing that the Rainforest Action Network and a bunch of other organizations had already gotten this. They were way ahead of me. They were like in the 20 teens and 2013, they were rappelling off of the football stadium in Charlotte and like trying to draw attention to banks. Stop the flow of money and you can have these systemic changes. So I just end by saying that I think we could be at the dawn of a new era of environmentalism that focuses on finance as a way of getting the change we need faster than through the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, which, by the way, like I look at businesses all around the country and you can see all these businesses that are in violation of Clean Water and Clean Air Act, and the EPA does nothing because they don't have the resources to go after every little nook and cranny. You've got one big player, really like four, you think about like Chase or Wells Fargo. Target Energy's there. And could laws regulate those businesses in ways that changes the game? I'm excited to see what happens.
Yeah, this is taking a look at it in a slightly different way, but I advise a company called Juro, and they're a fintech consumer spending app, and their algorithm helps consumers to understand the carbon costs of the purchases that they make, so that over time you can reduce your carbon footprint by being more conscious of how you're spending money. And I think it kind of goes back to really what we were talking about with people's relationship to food and it becoming more personal. Slightly different than what you were talking about, but I think having a higher degree of consciousness of what is the actual impact of consumption generally in whatever vector you might think about it through.
Totally. And I think that's one component of it. The other that I'm mentioning though is like these federal interventions. And I really believe strongly in that. Like whether we're talking about farming and the USDA's policies or whether we're talking about banking and financial regulations, I honestly don't think any of these things are going to change until you change the rules. You could argue that Monsanto and Bayer is just doing what they're designed to do. They're like trying to figure out how to make as much money as they possibly can. And if we don't create rules that say, well, okay, but you can't do this, then I really believe we're kind of stuck. So I believe in consumer choice or I bike to work every day. I think it's actually sad when people are like, don't worry about it. You don't need to recycle or anything like that. I disagree with that. Your individual choices, I think, matter. In part because I'm a teacher. I walk into a classroom, remember students were like, well, you drive to work. And now I can be like, I don't. And not to say that it makes me better or anything else, but I think if we all model, as we said, consciousness, like if you're modeling that in your behavior, like I've noticed it with my students. I think they'll go further with me because they know I make certain sacrifices myself. Doesn't mean that I'm perfect or that I've got everything figured out, but those consumer choices matter. And I think if you're doing those things right now, keep doing them. I think that, the thing that we see in history is like, it's pebbles, just little waves that then have these big effects. That said, vote, and get out there and pay attention to what's going on at the EPA. They have public hearings, like show up if there's a chemical being sprayed. I know Erin had something happen at a friend who's living here in Maine. There was a chemical being used near her house, and she was just that voice who showed up and was like, hey, I want to know more about it. Like, tell me, like, don't just take it all for given that it's safe or that it should be used. Like, ask questions. That doesn't mean everyone's a scientist or knows everything, but I think, I do the same thing at restaurants sometimes, just asking where it's sourced, like not trying to be a nag, but just like, hey, I want to know, like, how have you thought through these things? And I think if we do that, then we can see the kind of systemic changes we need. Consumer choices and purchasing matter, but we also need to have these structural changes that come from being an active citizen.
Yeah, I think the mental model that I have, number one, I believe that all resistance actually comes at the request of power, and things like I was talking to Erin about this, I think. I remember the moment in my childhood when I first encountered organic milk, and I saw it at a hypermart, which was a Walmart. It was like a cool new thing in Kansas City at the time, and I was like, wow, they have organic fruits and vegetables, they have organic milk. And over time, the more consumers became aware of and demanded that thing, the more the source of power produced that thing, because there was an opportunity for, to gain profit. So I really think about it as both trickle down and bubble up, because you're right. Like all those small pebbles, whether it's somebody thinking about what's the carbon footprint of something I'm purchasing or riding their bike to work, I think that thinking more about like, what am I doing? Why? How do I want the world to be? can lead to greater political activism, participation, the demand for federal interventions or change at that level.
Yeah.
And I think it's just one of the many levers I think that can lead to actually having that high level top down change as well.
And I think it's also, we should throw in the conversation about class and ability to do these things. We're sitting in a beautiful place and we're talking in a podcast. And I always think about this, like, one of the reasons I think I decided to do the work I do is because I could, because I think somebody listening to this said, well, that's great. You're back to work, but somebody that might be in a wheelchair, somebody that might have some condition that prevents them from doing that, or they just don't have the money or the time that they're trying to take care. I get all that, which is why I think if you do, I feel this kind of, desire to try and fight harder because I have this opportunity to try and to be awake every day and do something that gives back. I obviously mentor a lot of young people, 18 to 22, they're coming through my classes and they're always trying to figure out what to do in terms of a job. And I think a lot of people would say, do something that you're passionate about. But as I started this whole thing, I'm passionate about paddling. I'm a passionate cycler. I'm a passionate all those things. But it was really when I flipped that question and said, what is it that I have to give? What is it that I have to give? Like that's something, a skill or something that I can give to the public that could be of use. That was when I found happiness, I think, in my own life, because, I loved being out there instructing. You could argue I was giving by teaching whitewater kayaking and stuff, but there was a little bit more about me. It was like, I really enjoy the fun of doing this. And I don't want to ever give up those things. I love doing them. But this kind of thing, these podcasts, the teaching, the writing, that felt like something that, where I was giving back every day. So I'm always telling the students, there's real problems to be solved. If you can figure out what you have to give, I think that's where you start really feeling like, you wake up every day, like with the sense of purpose, a sense of, happiness really. But I don't know, it may not work for everybody. It's kind of been my thing. And so, I feel that, and I think especially as a teacher, trying when I can not to compromise on things like biking to work, if I can, trying to model the reuse, just showing that there's other ways to do it instead of constantly having a bottle of water. I always will have Coke products around me wherever I sit when I'm giving talks. And I'm like, I don't want to drink these bottled water. So you gave me this wonderful mason jar, which I have at my house, and I just think those things matter. And you hear people all the time like, it doesn't really make a difference. It does. I've seen it in the eyes of young people. It makes them be like, you know what? I can do better. I can fight a little bit harder, So I try and do both, fight for the structural change, but also look for the things I can do in my own life to make a difference.
Yeah. And I think that your point about privilege in this conversation is spot on and a really important one to highlight. Just having the privilege of being able to have enough food to eat, to have money to get the food, to put food on the table, to have the option for me, like I can go up the block to an organic grass-fed beef farm. Like I'm very aware not everybody has that choice, or like to go buy a gallon of organic milk right now when milk costs are through the roof because of what's happening with commodity prices in the Ukraine. But, doing what you can with what you have and holding the door open for other people and elevating others is what it's all about, I think.
And, one of the things I was thinking about when I was coming into this conversation with you is, you've done some pretty impressive athletic things. I've listened to some of the people on here who've done just amazingly challenging things, whether it be a century or a double century or Everesting or, like all sorts of amazing things. And part of it is just being supportive of people who are doing those things. Like I think there's a part of society where jealousy takes over and people want to be cynical. Why do they do that? Or why do they do this? Right. And instead, if you flip that and say like, this is kind of amazing, the capacity that someone has to do something so incredible and challenging, and to embrace that, to embrace people who are questioning or like trying to do something so radical or different that like it requires commitment and a sacrifice and just being a voice that supports those people. It's like, go for it, man. I'm in your corner, because you're expanding the possibilities of what we can do as humans, and that's awesome. And so that's the other side of it. I guess what I'm saying is like, it's so easy to be a cynic. It's so easy to be like critical. It's so easy to be negative. But I'm around some folks. My brother-in-law did like 16,000 miles on his bike the other day on Strava. He was tracking it or whatever. And it's just like, dang, man, that's incredible. Being there to support each other as we make these challenging choices, whether it be in farming or whatever it is, and be like, you're going to mess up. You're going to fall. It's going to be tough, but like, stick with it. It's inspiring to all of us,
Yeah. And I've written about this topic and I've thought about it a lot because I've been involved in riding bikes with gears for over 30 years. And I rode, BMX bikes and whatever before that. And as I think about the space that cycling occupies in my life now, I don't think that there's anything more selfish actually than being an endurance athlete and like having the time and money to like have a nice bike and like take time out of your day to go exercise and manufacture these challenges for yourself. But at the same time, for me, that's my vector it's like the mise en place in my life. It helps me organize everything. It helps me understand myself, people around me, the world better. It connects me to a community of people. And, I love it and it has its value. But I also have self-awareness about, this is incredibly selfish on a Saturday. I'm going to get up at 5 and go out and ride for 3 hours and whatever. But it makes me a better person when I come back to my family.
I think so. I'm thinking of a friend of mine that runs Centuries, and which to me was like baffling. I'd never thought about running that long or whatever, but he's a really good person, and like, I think that the journey he's on and the lessons he learns on those runs and things like that, he brings back to the community that he's a part of, and the kindness he shows, because you got to have a certain patience. You've got to have a certain ability to kind of like things go wrong and push through. And like, I think those lessons along those journeys are useful, which I think brings me back full circle to kind of like my own journeys on those things. I had completion issues or things like that, but I learned a lot during those journeys, and they're still a part of my routine, the mountain biking and the paddling. And I look at rapids differently now. I did get pinned on that river I was telling you about, the Flint River's Yellow Jacket Shoals. I think I got sidetracked there, and I remember that I had all the camping gear. I was by myself. It was dumb. As a paddler, you don't do that. And I always paddle with somebody now, but that was one of those alligator moments, John Muir moments. I saw the power of nature in those moments, that I was very vulnerable. One could argue that's the lesson of those types of things. Like, you're just less cocky. You're less arrogant. Especially now that I have kids. I was standing over a waterfall the other day that maybe when I was younger, I would have said, let's go do it. And the other folks in the group did it. And I was like, not today. And it was purely respect for the rapid itself. I probably could have done it just fine, but I knew the consequences if I didn't. And that's probably the biggest message of what we're saying. Like, how could you think differently about the food system? It's just that respect. It's that fundamental respect for nature that's like, it's incredibly powerful. Don't treat it like something you can just spray something on and you've got it all figured out. That's that kind of arrogance, history shows you, gets you in real trouble. So I'm happy for those experiences on the trail, on the river, because I think they showed me a relatively cocky guy, I should say, for someone who was so concerned about, or at least on the face of it, people would see me and maybe think I was really confident. The truth was, I felt very vulnerable. But then when I had those experiences in nature, I think it was the kind of vulnerability everyone should have, which is just like, I am so small. My time is so ephemeral in this space. These rivers are like ancient, in some cases. I better pay attention to it. I should listen a little bit more. So Yeah, nature's cool. And it's been a great part of my education. And, I went to school in New Hampshire. They told us when we got to school, they said, if you're not out in these mountains, a good chunk of your time up here, you're not getting the education you paid for. And they were right. I learned a lot right here in the space that we're sitting in. So, I want to come back.
And there's more to learn, and it's time to return you to nature. So, Bart, thanks for spending time with me today. If people want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
A wonderful website created by a good friend of mine, BartElmore.com. Zubin Desai, shout out to him. He's been just an amazing friend who helped create it. But BartElmore.com is where all my stuff is. And as it says on there, if you send me an email, my advisor, Ed Ayers, who we talked about, one of the busiest people I ever knew, and he always made time to always get back. I just don't believe in not responding. So you're right. I'll definitely try and get back to you. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. This is Andrew Vance. Thanks for listening to Choose the Hard Way. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate it 5 stars wherever you listen, and leave a positive review. Go to choosethehardway.com to sign up for the newsletter and share this episode with a friend who likes hearing stories about doing hard things.